Thank you for listening to this fantastic show on the Crawlspace Media Network.
We want to talk to you about another show on the Crawlspace Media Network.
There are thousands of missing person cases in the United States, but few have captured the attention, imagination, and passion that Maura Murray's 2004 disappearance has. It was even the subject of the Oxygen Network's 6-part series, The Disappearance of Maura Murray.
And Tim, no one knows this better than you and I because we started working on a documentary about Maura Murray in 2013, and this was an exploration into the fascinating world of citizen detecting. We started the podcast 2 years later and soon realized that we could do more in bringing answers to Maura's case as well as other cold cases.
That's right, and the Maura Murray case has raised many ethical and social questions. How do we, as true crime media, interact with law enforcement, family and friends of victims, potential persons of interest?
And how do we know when we've crossed that ever-elusive line between ethics and entertainment? These are the issues that we deal with.
So join us for the journey that is the Missing Maura Murray podcast. We started it in 2015. There are over 100 episodes on the disappearance of Maura Murray. We traveled to the site of her disappearance. We received actual threats. We hiked a mountain, and we head to Canada with an obsessed journalist.
So listen as the show grows and matures with support from a network of peers in the true crime arena.
Listen to Missing Maura Murray on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you listen to your podcasts.
You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway Murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. I'm Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And we are pleased to be back with you. It has been a crazy couple of days, but we are happy to be kicking off 2021 with our 51st episode. And we are joined again by my partner in crime, Bill Thomas, talking about victims advocacy. Thank you for being here, Bill.
Well, thank you. I had no choice. I have to co-host this thing, don't I? Isn't that the requirement?
It has been an eventful past year, but we are so thrilled to have developed our podcast, and we're having a whole lot of fun with it. We hope you are enjoying listening to it, and we're just going to continue that fun right through the remainder of 2021 and beyond.
Speaking of exciting news, we are able to confirm now that our long-developing television series on the Colonial Parkway Murders, which is entitled The Lover's Lane Murders, for reasons none of us can understand, will be making its debut on the Oxygen Network February 8th and 9th. There are 4 one-hour episodes, and for you binge watchers, we'll have 2 episodes on Monday night, February 8th, 2 episodes on Tuesday night, February 9th.
We are so excited.
Yay!
To be able to officially announce this. I know that we've had people who were like, wait, I heard that thing was happening. Did it ever happen? It happened.
It did happen. It did happen.
And it's been kind of floating around for a little bit, waiting for the right time to make its debut. But it is coming out in February, and we are very excited.
So a reminder for those of you who are cable or satellite subscribers, you need to check now to make sure that you have the Oxygen Network, and we will be on the air on February 8th and 9th. And when we say we are actually in the show. They made a highly questionable decision to interview both of us, and so we appear on the show. It's a serious topic. At the same time, working with the production team and investigators, it was really quite an honor, and they did a fantastic job. We think you'll really like the show. February 8th and 9th on the Oxygen Network. Lover's Lane Murders.
We will, of course, continue to provide updates and promote it and cross-promote it with our social media page for the Colonial Parkway Murders. So you may be bombarded with content from 2 sides, but it's only because we want you to watch our TV series.
It's a multi-platform world, as they say in Hollywood. Kristin, you put out this question to our listeners of Mind Over Murder if they had questions that we would do our best to answer them. Now that you took the plunge, people have asked questions. Is that my understanding?
Yes, we have had some interesting questions. And so I'm going to go ahead and just pitch those to you, and you can feel free to answer however you see fit.
Okay.
And I do want to shout out the longtime fan of Mind Over Murder who did ask these questions. Shout out to Robert Gray. Thank you so much for asking such excellent, detailed, thorough questions. And thank you so much for listening to Mind Over Murder. We really appreciate it. So this is a question. I'm just going to go ahead and phrase it exactly as he did. Bill, have you or any of the CPM families considered lobbying the Virginia state or federal government to make legislative and regulatory changes to how cold cases are handled?
The answer is yes, Robert. The Virginia-based Colonial Parkway Murders families, very specifically Call and Haley families, and I hope I'm not leaving anybody out, had done a significant amount of work back in the 90s lobbying the Virginia legislature for improved access to information about cold cases and moving cold cases forward. I wasn't living in Virginia. As a matter of fact, I think some of you know I never lived in Virginia, and my family's not from Virginia. The Dowski family and the Thomas family, Cathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski's families, are not from Virginia. So we've never lived there. Obviously, our loved ones were at the time of their murders. So I'm less familiar with all of the work that specifically the Call and Haley families have done in the past. But they created a not-for-profit organization called FFACT, which was Family and Friends Against Crime Today.
Yes, Family and Friends Against Crime Today.
And so they did a significant amount of work. We have also thought about doing things at the federal level. That gets a little more complicated and expensive. Obviously, our case is split between two parts are FBI, that is federal jurisdiction, and two parts are Virginia State Police, that is Commonwealth of Virginia jurisdiction. It is something we've thought about, and we may return to that topic. Likely jumping off from the television series, we may end up lobbying our investigative agencies to put more resources into the case. But it's a good question, and it's a little bit open-ended.
Yes. Here is actually, this one has multiple parts to it, so I'll just pitch it, and then you can address it as you see fit. And I know this is going to be a long answer, so I'll just go ahead and toss it. What are your ultimate thoughts on how your sister's case might be solved?
I think the most likely potential outcome could be through DNA evidence. Our challenge, as we've talked about on our Facebook page, is that our DNA evidence, our forensic evidence, is 30 to 34 years old. Crime scenes were not securely controlled like they are now. Remember, to be fair to everybody, it was a pre-DNA environment. Law enforcement didn't follow the same protocols that they do in 2021. Back in 1986 to 1989. I think forensic genealogy or other advanced forensic testing is certainly a possibility. There's always the possibility that a tipster or family member, ex-wife, ex-husband, you name it, might come forward with information which would lead investigators to identify potential perpetrators. And then there's always, I guess, the deathbed confession, which seems unlikely in this example.
For the benefit of our listeners, during the time that we have run the Colonial Parkway Murders social media pages, we have received information of all types on all of those different things. We have received information about DNA, about possible tipsters, about family, members who felt they had heard a confession or received a confession. We have really seen all of those possibilities. And, we hope eventually one of these days we'll get the tip that breaks the case.
Our goal is to always get that information and pass that on to the appropriate investigators.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then this is the third question from Robert. In cases such as your sister's, where so much time has passed and the perpetrator is likely advancing in age or potentially deceased, do you feel it is a race against the clock to solve it?
I would say yes. I've said recently that, and I'm offering only my personal perspective, for me and my family, we feel like we're looking for answers at this point, not necessarily a prosecution. Now, if we ever had a suspect or suspects to focus on, our attitude might shift. Right now, I feel, in talking to my brothers, we're more interested in looking for answers. Why did this happen? How did this happen? If we get to the who question, we might feel differently. And if this person is still alive, which is possible, our case is 34 years old. If somebody was 30 back then, they could be in their 60s now or in their 70s. It's entirely possible they're still alive. Obviously, if a suspect is identified, we would want him or her to be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. I guess we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I do feel the passage of time, and as I've mentioned before, we've lost 8 of the 16 total parents in the Colonial Parkway murders now. Our folks have gotten older and have passed on. Both of my parents are gone now. They were very much alive when Kat was killed. Any number of our moms and dads are gone now. We're down to half strength of the 8 victims, 16 parents. We're down to 8 remaining. And some people have lost both sides. The Thomases and the Calls, just off the top of my head, have lost both sets of parents. And others have lost one or the other. That's very sad. It's difficult for all of us as the siblings of murder victims to see our parents go to their graves not knowing who killed their loved ones.
There was sort of a part B to this question. If the perpetrator is deceased or passes before the case is closed, does this significantly affect the chance of the case being solved?
I don't think it does impact the opportunity to solve the case. We've seen in a number of other cases, perpetrators identified, even within the last few weeks, in other solved cases. It's not necessarily the outcome that all of us want. Back to that idea of just having these profound questions, what happened to our loved ones and how did this happen and why? I think we're going to have to accept the fact that with cases like ours that have been cold for so long, it's possible that some of the people involved are gone. I mean, certainly, as I mentioned, the parents a few minutes ago, and then we've got investigators and journalists and other family members. And, we've lost a lot of people along the way. So it's possible that the perpetrator could be, or perpetrators could be among those lost. I would still take much greater satisfaction for me personally. I often speak for the families, but I have to be careful on something that's as personal as this. I can't say that my views necessarily reflect how everybody else in the Colonial Parkway murders families feels. It's like the death penalty or anything else. We all might have our own point of view there.
Sure. Well, excellent. If, as listeners, you have other questions that you would like for Bill to address, please feel free to leave those on our social pages, whether that's on the Mind Over Murder page or the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page. If you are interested in this case and you have not had a chance to check out our Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page, please do so. We have a lot of good information available there, and that is a great way to make sure that you never miss any updates from us. On our previous 2 episodes of Mind Over Murder, my partner in crime decided to get into his feelings about victims advocacy and the ins and outs of what it means to be an advocate in a cold case. Bill, how did you develop these ideas about victims advocacy? Was it something organic that developed over time, or was this something that you just had to learn by experience?
Well, I think it's both. It's mostly through trial and error. Any insight that I can offer has come about as a result of me making mistakes and learning from those mistakes, and then hopefully making a few good moves, trying to sort those out as I went along and thinking, if I could do that over again, what would I do differently? How could I do it better? And then what happened starting 11 years ago when I got much more involved in the Colonial Parkway murders was people were contacting me and us asking about how we had managed to increase the visibility of the Colonial Parkway murders and get the FBI and the Virginia State Police to put more resources into the case. And people felt like we had begun to gather new momentum, and they were impressed with that, which was very nice. And they would ask, how did you all go about doing that? That forced me to kind of begin to think about, well, okay, how did we do that? And so I began jotting down some ideas. Ultimately, a book will come out about the Colonial Parkway murders, and I cover some of these issues, but I thought it would be interesting to talk about some of them. So mostly trial and error.
So let's actually start at the very beginning. If the unfortunate circumstance befalls someone that they are faced with the death of a loved one through violent crime, what are the challenges that they will face from day one?
Well, in addition to the grief and the loss and all of those things that any of us will go through, whether we lose someone to violent crime or just lose someone to injury or accident or old age or whatever, all of those things are pretty natural. But then for people that lose someone to violent crime, as we talked about in the previous 2 episodes, it's real important to remember there are 250,000 cold case murders in the United States. So the numbers right away are daunting. As we talked about, the close rate in murder investigations, homicide investigations in the United States is plunging. It is headed in the wrong direction. When I was a kid back in the 60s, the close rate was over 90%. Now the close rate for homicides is in the mid-60s and dropping every year. I just heard a news story on National Public Radio the other day that in some major cities, the close rate for homicides is in the 40% range. That means that just nationally, you only have a 6 in 10 chance of your loved one's homicide or other violent crime being solved, and that's over the long haul. And then in some major cities, it's down near 40%. Those challenges are pretty significant. And as we've talked about on this podcast and in interviews in the past, this is all due to a challenge of time, attention, and resources. The challenge that family members are going to face are all the things I just laid out, plus the fact that they are going to have to fight, and I mean literally fight, to see their loved one's violent crime solved.
What accounts for the close rates on violent crimes plunging so precipitously? Do you have any insight into what might be causing that?
Well, all I can tell you is what I've learned and read, and I hope that sometime in the next few months we'll be able to have Thomas Hargrove from the Murder Accountability Project on as a guest. He had said yes, it's just been a scheduling question, and he's amazing. In talking to Thomas and other experts, what they tell me is we're not putting enough money into law enforcement. And personal opinion, we're spending money in the wrong areas. Instead of militarizing our police force with leftover vehicles that look like they would have come out of Operation Iraqi Freedom, which I don't think belong on the streets of American cities and towns, what we need to do is be putting more money into resources like cold case squads and bringing back expert retired investigators, many of whom are still quite young, but have great experience, bring them back as consultants or part-timers or whatever works for them to start working on this backlog of 250,000 cold cases. It's the same thing as everything else. I think if we, the American people, have the will and the focus to push our elected leaders to put resources into cold cases, we can reduce the number of cold cases. It's just that simple, but it's just like anything else. We have to be willing to make that commitment.
You and I have talked about this particular topic a number of times. Do you feel, for the record, that coordination between law enforcement agencies has gotten better over the years, or do you feel it has gotten worse over the years?
I think it's pretty stalled. There are 17,000 law enforcement agencies across the country, which is way too many. When I talk to people in other countries, they can't believe that we have 17,000 different law enforcement agencies. I'm fine with local control, and everybody wants to have a law enforcement officer, police are important, and they want to have somebody local that they can talk to about a problem. Obviously, not all of the issues that law enforcement deal with are necessarily rising to the level of unsolved murders and sexual assault. I don't think the coordination between agencies is very good at all from our personal experience in the Colonial Parkway murders.
Yeah.
There have to be better ways to have cross-jurisdictional communication agency to agency. Criminals, including murderers and rapists, know that the coordination is terrible, and that's why they cross jurisdictional lines to commit crime. As a matter of fact, that may actually be part of the pattern in the Colonial Parkway murders. If this is the same perpetrator, we have someone who is clearly crossing jurisdictional lines and committing crimes. And I think it's possible, and certainly this is proven to be the case in other unsolved murder cases, that perpetrators who are smart enough to get away with serial murder know that if they move from town to town, that these towns don't talk to each other very much. And if you go into an unincorporated area of a county, there isn't much law enforcement at all. And that's definitely an issue in the Colonial Parkway murders. And remember, our cases are 30 to 34 years old now. So when we talk about a place like New Kent County in Virginia, New Kent County has more law enforcement and more investigators now than they did 30 years ago. Perpetrators knew these things, and they knew that they could move smoothly and easily from one location to another and have very little communication between those agencies.
And for the record, for people who may not be familiar with the ins and outs of our case, there are 2 Virginia State Police cases, but they are handled by 2 separate Virginia State Police offices, which seems a little counterintuitive. But there you go. It is very... I don't know what the communication is like between those 2 offices, but certainly, the fact that this isn't handled by one Virginia State Police office, it is handled by 2. It's got to compound the confusion and the frustration, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely.
When a family finds themselves in this unfortunate role of having to deal with the loss of a loved one through violent crime and have to sort of step up to make sure that their case is getting a time, attention, and resources, what are some of the basic steps that they should take to ensure that they are moving in the right direction?
Obviously, I'm not overlooking the grieving process or the shock and the recovery period that all of us have to deal with. What I'm talking about, too, I think the principles would apply for a missing persons case in the same way that they would for a murder case or a sexual assault or other serious crime. In talking about these things, I don't mean to make it sound like disrespectful in any way. I'm just trying to focus on moving your loved one's case forward. I think getting organized is incredibly important and needs to be done right away. And I think sometimes it can be helpful, for example, to have a family member that might be like one step removed from the center of the grief. They might be the appropriate person to help get things started. So, for example, whether it's a brother or sister-in-law or an aunt or an uncle or someone like that who obviously is feeling the loss but isn't necessarily right at the core. It can be very helpful to have them start. I think it's really important for people to sit down and they need to think about what's available to us in terms of media outlets. Social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok has been used recently. I used to think of TikTok as, a place where you'd watch silly short dance videos with 13-year-old kids, but TikTok's actually been used very effectively. Sarah Turney used TikTok very effectively in moving her sister's unsolved murder forward. This is quite recently. I don't think TikTok had been used before. I think it's a matter then of literally taking a few minutes and tuning up and down the radio and television dial. Find out what's there. Find out what's left. I think newspapers are incredibly important, an often overlooked resource in communities, not just for the purposes that we're talking about in this podcast, but I think newspapers are incredibly important as a resource. Find out what's available in your town, other nearby cities and towns, and you've got to start creating a press list. You've got to be reaching out to people and explaining who you are and calling or emailing and saying, I'm the brother-in-law of a murder victim, or I'm the sister of a missing person. Who would I talk to about that story? I often think that people have a tendency to focus on national media first because it's very high profile. A woman contacted me a couple of months ago and she said, I need a story in People magazine about my murdered son. Now, I'm not saying that a story in People magazine wouldn't be beneficial. And actually, People magazine has made more of a focus on true crime than they ever have in the past. So I'm not ruling it out, but I just thought it was odd. I'm not criticizing anybody, but I just thought it was really odd that her version of how to move her son's unsolved murder was built around getting People magazine to write a story. I'm not saying it's a bad idea. I just wouldn't have made it my top priority. I think what you need to be doing is working locally and regionally and on a state-by-state basis, because the local angle is incredibly important to news media. Even when you're using national platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, they're also focusing content on stories on a regional basis. They just don't make it incredibly obvious that they're tracking you. You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. One of the most frequent questions we're asked here at Mind Over Murder is, how can I help?
Thanks to Othram, a leading forensic DNA testing lab for law enforcement, you can get involved and help solve real cases.
If you have tested at a consumer genetics company, you can contribute your data to DNAsolves.com. The process is easy and confidential. Just 2 simple steps. Your DNA might be the missing piece that helped solve the identity of an unknown person.
Then Mind Over Murder will highlight cases Othram is working on to seek your crowdfunding support for DNA testing to help solve these cold cases.
Upload your DNA profile to DNAsolves.com. It's easy, free, and confidential.
Then join Mind Over Murder as we help families find answers with Othram and DNAsolves.com.
Jody Loomis, Jessica Baggin, Kelly Ann Prosser, Michelle Martinko, Christy Mirak, Carolyn Rose. Do these names mean anything to you? All these people are murder victims whose cases were cold for decades, until recently. They were solved by investigative genetic genealogy. This new crime-solving tool is rapidly providing us with the names of elusive killers. But each one of these cases is unique and worth exploring. Each episode of the DNA ID podcast will focus on one newly solved case and look at the story behind the headline. Who was the victim? Who was their killer? And why did this tragic crime occur? It's brought to you by Abjack Entertainment, hosted and produced by me, Jessica Betancourt, and co-produced by Mike Morford. Make sure you subscribe to DNA ID today, wherever you listen to podcasts, so you don't miss a single episode.
Do you like our show, Mind Over Murder, and want to create your own podcast?
Well then, let us tell you about Anchor.
First of all, it's free. And who doesn't love free, right?
I like free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer.
You can even add any song from Spotify directly to your episodes. The possibilities are endless for what you can create, whether it's music analysis, your own radio show, or something the world's never heard before.
Anchor will then distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and many more platforms.
And you can even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership.
I like the sound of that. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Right here, Anchor.
Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started on your own podcast.
You can tell them Kristin and Bill from Mind Over Murder sent you. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
You certainly do have a number of really excellent allies in the local media here who have been very, very helpful, as we discussed last episode, in making sure that not only has the story of the Colonial Parkway murders remained in the media, but that it continually gets reported and revamped as updates happen. We've been lucky to have some truly excellent TV reporters and print reporters on our side, and certainly I think that's an excellent point, that the better relationships you can develop with media, the better off you're going to be.
In terms of like media relations basics, and I understand that people didn't set out to be public relations people. We all have different jobs that we've done. I've actually been a PR spokesperson and media spokesperson and so on, so it was part of my career. People have to understand the basics of talking to people, differentiating between an on-the-record conversation where you can be quoted and an off-the-record conversation where you cannot be quoted, or what people refer to as on background versus on foreground usually, but people will say on the record, off the record. Sometimes it can be helpful, and I insist on this because I've done so many interviews over the years about the Colonial Parkway murders and other topics. I insist on having most of the conversation be off the record because I might say something that's a little too blunt or kind of inartful or not well phrased, that kind of thing. And then when you're ready and you've given them the background about your loved one and what the circumstances are and what your goals are, and you probably don't want to necessarily say those on the record at that moment, then when they say, well, I'd like to quote you on that, well, say, okay, well, let's, put a pin in that and then circle back and say, okay, I'm now prepared to go on the record. Now, the whole conversation, for example, might be taped, but if you make a differentiation between off the record, on background, and on the record, then you can think about what is the message, the short message that I want to give my reader, viewer, listener, whatever. And remember, they're not going to use most of what you give them. They're only going to use short snippets. It's very frustrating. You'll talk to somebody for an hour and then they'll do a story. And if it's a print story, there'll be 2 or 3 quotes. And if it's a television story, they're probably only going to use one little snippet. So if you're disciplined and say, now I'm on the record, what you want to make sure is you're saying the 1 or 2 things that you want your audience to carry away, and that requires discipline. Now, remember, there's a deal here. Local media want to cover local stories, and like it or not, because of the circumstances of your missing loved one or, heaven forbid, your murdered or sexually assaulted family member, they need you. And they need access to you and your family. You're providing the human interest in what is otherwise a tragic story. So-and-so was murdered today. So you're providing something that they want, but you also have to understand that you don't have to answer every question they ask you. You can say pass. You can be polite about it, but you can say pass, no comment, and they're not going to put no comment in the newspaper or on TV or what have you. Answer the questions that you want to answer and work your talking points. Actually keep a piece of paper in front of you with the 2 or 3 things that you want your audience to take away. And when you go on the record, you work those talking points. This is how people get elected to office, by the way. When we watch political figures talk on TV or the radio or whatever, and you listen to the question that's being asked, and then you think to yourself, well, he or she didn't answer that question. No, they talked about what they wanted to talk about, regardless of what the question was. They'll say, that's a great question, Jane. And then they'll say whatever it is they want to say. Now, you don't have to sound like a politician. You don't have to give long answers like a politician. But if you want to make it clear that our 13-year-old son, Johnny, is missing in Springfield, Ohio, and we need the public's help in looking for 13-year-old Johnny, there's 3, I just made that up, but those are 3 sentences. We need your help. He was last seen at the such and such sports field. Again, I'm just making this up. Those are the things you need the public to be focused on. Forgive me, but the fact that Johnny's an amazing kid and that his family misses him. Those things are natural emotional reactions to the fact that your son is missing and you're terrified. I get it. What you need to keep people focused on is the fact that this boy is 13 years old and is missing from such and such a place. Those kind of thoughtful approaches where you understand what media people are looking for. You have to think in sound bites. I know this is awful and sounds I hope it doesn't sound too cold, but that's how you have to think when you're thinking about media.
I remember the first time that you and I had a discussion over the phone 6 years ago now. I very distinctly recall the first hour and a half, because it's us and we've always talked a lot on the phone. The first hour and a half of our conversation, you said, this is completely off the record. You don't get to use this in your book. This is just you and me talking. And it was only about after 90 minutes, you were like, okay, now I'm willing to talk. And it was like, okay,
yeah.
Cool. I guess that first 90 minutes was just, and it definitely felt like it was you sizing me up. And I'm sure that it was to a certain extent.
Absolutely. And I think it's fine to ask media people, what do you need? How can I help you do your job? Remember, you're providing something of great value to them, which is this information and the focus on the local community. And at the same time, they're giving you something which is of great value, which is they're amplifying your voice. I think it's also important that people understand in terms of working with law enforcement, and I've made these mistakes myself. You want to try to keep your relationship with law enforcement cordial and respectful. I've certainly crossed the line any number of times in the frustration of the moment when I encountered what I thought were institutional resistance points or foot dragging or whatever. I know it's difficult, and it's been very difficult for me with my Irish temper not to lose it and get angry. If you do, all you can do is calm down, apologize, and move on. But with law enforcement, you want to try to develop a relationship with your investigators. And this is something I've said to any number of family members, and this has happened to all of us then over time. You have to try to develop personal relationships with these law enforcement people. Try, if possible, to get personal cell phone numbers and email addresses from these individuals, because over and over again, law enforcement investigators will be yanked off cases with no explanation whatsoever to the families. If you can get a personal cell phone number or a personal email address, it's not always easy. What you want to try to be able to do is have some way to backdoor with your investigators, because they'll get pulled off your case and then you will literally never hear from them again. Law enforcement does not think of themselves as working for the families, and they will make decisions at a command level that have nothing to do with, you or your family or the goal you've set out, which is to solve your loved one's murder or identify a perpetrator or find your missing son or daughter, or whatever it is. You have to understand that these things happen with no regard to how that's going to impact the family. I remember talking to a number of different families over the years about this, and they're like, oh my gosh, that's already happened to us. They just make decisions. The chiefs, the sheriffs, whatever it is, the head of the agency, they make decisions on redeploying what they see as resources based on other crimes being committed, staffing issues, COVID-19, you name it. It can be any number of things that have nothing whatsoever to do with your family member. So you have to expect change. We've had any number of FBI agents, for example, handle my sister Cathy and Rebecca Dowski's unsolved murder over the years. Now, I'm not expecting that someone's going to handle the Colonial Parkway murders for 34 years or anything like that. But agents come and go, investigators come and go. It's real important that you, if you can develop enough of a personal relationship with these investigators so that they can at least tell you off the record what they're doing now and who's going to be handling your case and that kind of thing.
Certainly, more than anyone, you and the other families in the Colonial Parkway murders understand that it can take a long, long time to solve a case or make any progress forward. So when you say family has to take the long-term outlook, what precisely do you mean?
Well, I've said this to any number of families over the years who've approached us. Nobody wants to be the case that takes months or years to solve, but it happens a lot. Mm-hmm. And as we talked about a few minutes ago, when you've got a close rate in the 60-some percentage range, that means there's a really good chance, close to 40%, that your loved one's murder or what have you is never going to be solved. And I'm sorry to be the one to tell you that. Even if you're one of the lucky ones who gets to a place of some sort of resolution where a perpetrator's identified, and then there's a long road that we haven't even gone down yet with the Colonial Parkway murders, which is an arrest, an indictment, prosecution, appeals. You have to understand that even to get to 60-some percent solve rate could take years. So real important. I mean, I'm not joking. Go to the store, buy a bunch of notebooks, start taking notes. I have hundreds of pages of notes from all of my conversations with the FBI, which I know they don't like. They've even told me they don't like it. One of the agents said to me, I can hear your pen scratching on the paper. And I said, how would I remember all this stuff? I've talked to you guys hundreds of times. Now, what they don't like is then later on you can say, well, wait a minute. You said such and such, and now you're saying something different. Or such and such an investigator, your predecessor, said this was going to happen, and now you're telling me something different. People don't necessarily like being called out, but at the same time, I don't know about anybody else, but there's no way I'm going to remember all that stuff. Even as important as my sister's murder investigation might be, there's a lot of detail. I buy same notebooks I used in high school and college, the by subject binders, and I tear the pages out and I move them into notebooks kind of by topic. That way I can remember this stuff later. Now, I choose to write these things down longhand. Somebody else may be a faster typist than I am. That wouldn't take much.
Yeah, that would be me.
I mean, I'm a two-finger typist at best. You need to take copious notes and ask a lot of questions of your investigators, your media partners, and all of the people that you're going to deal with to develop an understanding of what it is they're talking about. There's a lot of terminology, a lot of terms of art you're going to have to learn. I know this is a horrible time for most people. Has been for my family. I think certainly every crime victim and survivor I've ever met. But if you don't do it, no one else will.
Let's go ahead and get into the ins and outs of FOIA. For those of you who are not familiar with the term, FOIA is Freedom of Information Act. There's that whole concept of using FOIA requests to gain information. What kind of experience have you had with that, Bill? And how can families use FOIA to their advantage?
One of the biggest frustrations for families like ours is that law enforcement will refuse to answer questions. And this still happens frequently in the Colonial Parkway murders. Now, it wasn't until Blaine Pardo and Victoria Hester were working on their book on the Colonial Parkway murders, A Special Kind of Evil. This must be 4 years ago now. That was the first time I had any exposure to FOIA requests. Blaine had told me he'd had a lot of success with FOIA requests, and I have to give him a lot of credit. He showed me how to write these FOIA requests, which are actually pretty simple. You can find the format of a FOIA request on the internet, and then you'd send them to all of the agencies involved in your loved one's case, which might be more than one city or town, or it might be local, state, and federal law enforcement, or what have you. Basically a form letter that you type up and send, and you say, subject to the Freedom of Information Act, I'm requesting information regarding such and such an investigation. Oftentimes you'll get turned down, but I will say this, people will respond from time to time to FOIA requests with surprising and detailed information, which can be very helpful to you in understanding what's going on. Now, this is not something you're going to be worried about in the first week or first month or maybe even first year of your loved one's case. But remember, in some examples, we're talking about cases that go back years, maybe even decades. In those examples, sometimes these FOIA requests will result in very valuable information, which will give you a better insight into steps that might have been taken by law enforcement, what the status of various tests might be, investigative resources, that sort of thing. Even in the Colonial Parkway murders, where the FBI has given us the straight arm on any number of occasions to questions that I've had, FOIA requests ended up producing all sorts of information which we didn't have. Some of it was from other law enforcement agencies that had assisted in some way in the investigation in the early going, and other agencies. It takes a while, a few weeks, sometimes a few months to get a response, but the information was often very eye-opening. It's something I had not thought of before. I didn't realize how effective a tool it could be. But for cases that have gone on for some time, years or decades, as we talked about, the FOIA request can definitely be a good way to go. And you can find the format of a FOIA letter on the internet and then develop your own customized version of a FOIA request. It's definitely worth a try.
We spoke at some depth about this last episode, but I want to make sure that everybody understands that there is a work-life balance that has to come with being actively involved in a murder case. And Bill, if I can speak to just my own personal experience with Bill manages that really, really well. There are just as many times that I'll call him to talk about a case that we'll end up talking about something entirely not related to the case. And we end up laughing and talking about movies and TV shows and various other things. But, Bill, how do you keep a balance between dealing with this tragedy that has colored, I know, a large portion of your life? And how do you account for the fact that that can't take up everything?
Well, I'm not claiming I do it perfectly, and I think my family might complain that I don't do it as well as I should. It's a goal. I'm not saying I'm completely there, but it's just like anything else. I need to lose 10 pounds, which means I need to eat less and exercise more. It's the same sort of thing. It's a goal. It's an aspiration. It's something I'm trying to achieve. But I do try to put down what is admittedly an often heavy burden and look at other things, read other things, watch a great television show or a movie, listen to music. And I think it's very important. It's difficult with COVID these days, but to see family and friends and laugh and joke and talk about other aspects of your life. In terms of the loss, it's incredibly difficult at the start. Now, 34 years later, I can be a bit more balanced in terms of feeling the loss of my sister without it being completely all-consuming. And as I said, my family would definitely make the point, I think, that I have not always achieved that balance. I mean, even in the last couple of months, I'll give you an example. For some reason, people often approach me with tips in the Colonial Parkway murders around the holidays. Mm-hmm. As we talked about the other day, I think people have a little bit of extra time at the holidays, vacation time, family time, that kind of thing. And it's also, these are family-oriented holidays. And so people have kind of time to think about these things. So these are often strangers reaching out to us via social media and trying to get a hold of me and try to make myself easy to find. I'm the guy with the same cell phone number since the first cell phone I bought, I don't know how many years ago, and at least one of the same email addresses that I had from the very first time I went on this thing they call the World Wide Web. And I've done that very deliberately to make myself easy to find. But for some reason, people tend to reach out to me at the holidays, and this happened both at Thanksgiving and Christmas this year. Actually, over the next week or so, I hope to type those notes up and get those to the FBI because there were two independent tips that I thought might be worth looking into. At the same time, my partner Pamela was less than thrilled that I was texting dozens of times with this guy with a tip in the Colonial Parkway murders. But, he was plausible and credible. And
yeah.
he had some things that were worthwhile and that tied into some other issues that I knew about. So I followed up. But at the same time, did I get the stink eye from Pamela because I was taking my sweet time coming to sit down for Thanksgiving dinner because I was talking to this guy about my sister's unsolved murder case? Yeah. There's an example where maybe I didn't achieve that work-life balance that I think all of us need to try to achieve. The burden of your loss will become easier with time. That's the only thing I can say. It changes so slowly and it's so incremental that you don't even feel it. But then you'll realize years later, something, as bad as that loss was, it is not as heavy as it was when it first happened all those years ago.
Yeah. Well, this has been an excellent conversation with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas, who has done an excellent job advocating for his sister, Cathy, her girlfriend, Rebecca, and all of the other victims in the Colonial Parkway murders here in Virginia. Bill, as always, your work is admirable, and I can't tell you how much I admire you for what you're doing to keep Cathy and Becky and all the other cases moving forward, and with the hope that 2021 is going to be the year for this to ultimately come to some answers.
Well, thank you. We'll keep working on it.
Thank you so much for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawlspace Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.